A child stepped out of a burning mansion. In 1911, her parents dead. Her nightdress singed, but the porcelain doll in her arms was flawless, untouched by flame. For more than a century, no one could explain what followed: missing records, vanished artifacts, and photographs that seemed to show the doll watching on its own. If you believe some history is darker than legend, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The night of December 21st, 1911, should have been like any other winter evening in Salem, Massachusetts. But by dawn, two prominent citizens were dead, their home reduced to blackened timber, and a single child stood silent in the snow, clutching a porcelain doll that seemed untouched by the inferno. Neighbors would later recall the glow of flames rising into the night sky, drawing them from their beds and into the street. The Blackwood residence, a towering Victorian mansion with iron-gated gardens, was already engulfed when help arrived. The fire ate the house alive, one man told the Salem Gazette, his words printed days later. The blaze moved with unnatural speed, consuming walls and windows as if some unseen force had fanned the flames from within. The fire brigade, summoned by ringing bells and frantic shouts, could do little more than contain the disaster before it spread to nearby homes. They found Henry and Catherine Blackwood, the wealthy textile merchant, and his wife inside the charred library. Their remains were unrecognizable, but unmistakably adult. Amelia, their 7-year-old daughter, was nowhere to be found until a neighbor spotted her standing in the frozen garden, barefoot, her white nightdress soaked with snowdot, and in her arms, cradled like a living child, was the doll. Witnesses described the sight in uneasy tones. The porcelain figure was nearly as tall as Amelia's torso, dressed in a hand-stitched gown of deep burgundy fabric, with painted lips frozen in a faint smile. Most dolls of that era had dull, empty eyes, glass, or paint that reflected light without expression. But this doll's gaze was different. Even in the chaotic glow of fire and lantern light, its eyes seemed to catch and hold the light like real pupils. She didn't cry. She didn't shiver, recalled one neighbor years later. She just stood there, holding that doll, watching the fire, like she knew it was supposed to happen. The fire chief tried to lift Amelia to safety, but when he reached for the doll, she clutched it tighter with such force that he dared not separate them. The child's silence unnerved everyone present. Doctors would later describe her as being in a state of traumatic shock. Yet the townsfolk whispered a different story, that Amelia's calmness came not from shock, but from something the doll whispered only to her. Reporters seized on these details. The Salem Gazette ran the headline, "Child Survives Inferno with Doll in Arms. Miracle or Mystery?" Another paper called it a cruel irony, a child spared while her parents perished. But beneath the sensationalism lay a detail no one could explain. How had Amelia escaped? Her bedroom had been on the 2nd floor. The staircase was swallowed by fire, the windows barred for safety. Yet there she was, unharmed, standing outside with her doll, and the doll itself bore no marks of the fire. While Henry and Catherine's possessions burned to ash, while velvet drapes melted into embers, while the house collapsed into ruin, the porcelain figure remained pristine. Not a scorch, not a crack, not a singed thread on its ornate gown. It looked, in fact, more perfect than ever, as though it had been waiting to be seen. That night burned itself into the memory of Salem. Some said it was a miracle. Others muttered of darker things, curses, bargains, restless spirits. For while Amelia was alive, she would never again be seen smiling as she had in those photographs taken just months before. And the doll, which she refused to release, would soon be whispered about in homes across Massachusetts as Isabel, the Blackwood girl's constant, and perhaps unnatural, companion. What few could have guessed then was that this fire was not the end of the Blackwood story. It was the beginning of a puzzle that would stretch across more than a century. scattered through archives, diaries, and photographs, waiting for someone bold or foolish enough to assemble the pieces. Long before the flames swallowed the Blackwood mansion, neighbors had begun to whisper that something was not right inside its iron gates. At first, the rumors were ordinary enough servants leaving suddenly, arguments overheard through open windows, Catherine Blackwood looking pale and anxious when she went to town. But as 1911 wore on, the stories grew darker, centered always on the family's only child, Amelia, and the porcelain doll that never left her arms. That spring, the Blackwoods had returned from an extended trip through Europe. Henry's textile business had given the family wealth enough for travel, and Catherine's letters to her sister described visits to London, Paris, and Vienna. But it was their time in Romania that would later take on a sinister significance. One diary page, recovered decades later, carried Catherine's careful handwriting. An old woman insisted we take two of her dolls, calling them sisters. Henry dismissed her words as superstition, but I felt her gaze linger long after we left. I wish we had refused her. When they returned to Salem, Amelia was given one of the dolls for her birthday. She named it Isabel. From that moment, Catherine noted, her daughter would not let the doll out of her sight. Amelia carried it to meals, clutched it in church, and even refused to sleep without it. If Isabel was ever set aside, Amelia became hysterical until it was returned to her arms. At first, the parents indulged the obsession as an innocent attachment. But soon the servants noticed odd details. The doll was sometimes found sitting upright in rooms Amelia had not entered. Its position would shift between dusk and dawn, even when Amelia swore she had not touched it. One maid insisted she heard a second set of footsteps following Amelia down the hall, though she walked alone. Another claimed she heard two voices, Amelia soft and childish, and another lower, raspier, speaking from the same room. By midsummer, several staff had quit without explanation. One left a single line in her resignation letter: "I will not remain in a house where porcelain watches me at night." Neighbors began to speak of Catherine's increasingly strained expression. She was seen more often in church, sitting apart, lips moving silently in prayer. When asked by a confidant if she was ill, she reportedly replied, "It is not me I fear for, but my daughter. She speaks of things she should not know." The most chilling account came from a tutor briefly hired to give Amelia lessons in reading and arithmetic. His testimony, preserved in a local paper, described how Amelia often turned mid-lesson to the doll as if seeking its approval. Once, when asked to recite her sums, Amelia paused and listened to silence. Then she said clearly, "Isabel says I'm wrong. She says the answer is different." The tutor, unnerved, never returned after the first week. Catherine's diary entries grew increasingly desperate. "Amelia told me Isabel is angry when she is left in the trunk. I have not spoken of the second doll. How could she know of its existence? Objects go missing, only to be found neatly arranged beside Isabel's chair. Henry calls it childish fancy. But last night I woke to Amelia at my bedside, whispering that Isabel wants her sister released. She said it with such certainty that I dared not reply. Tomorrow I shall burn the second doll. I should have done so months ago, but Catherine never had the chance. By autumn, rumors of the family's unrest had reached the wider town. A story in the Salem Gazette reported disturbances at the Blackwood residence, citing anonymous sources who spoke of unearthly laughter and the sound of glass shattering without. Cause: Catherine's charity appearances dwindled. Henry, once sociable, was seen less often in the textile halls, his temper reportedly short. And Amelia, always with Isabel in her arms, seemed to grow thinner, her cheeks hollow, her eyes shadowed. A neighbor remembered seeing the girl one morning at the garden fence. She was talking to the doll as if it were her sister, the woman recalled. And then she looked at me and smiled. It was not the smile of a child. It was too knowing. Too old, by December, the Blackwood house stood as much a prison as a home. Servants gone, curtains drawn, only the faint glow of gas lamps visible at night. In one of her final letters, Catherine wrote, "The air is heavy here. I fear something watches, even when the rooms are empty. If the second doll remains hidden, perhaps the house will quiet. But I feel its presence, restless in the trunk. And Amelia knows. She always knows." 3 weeks later, the fire came. Some would say it was an accident, an overturned lamp, a dropped cigar in the library. Others insisted it was inevitable, that the house was doomed the moment those dolls crossed its threshold. Whatever the cause, the whispers before the fire became part of the tragedy's shadow, hints of a curse that would not end with the Blackwoods' deaths. For Amelia survived, and so did Isabel. And though the second doll never appeared in official records, its ghost lingered in rumor and memory waiting, as if for the day someone would look too closely at the photographs left behind. When the flames of the Blackwood house finally died, little remained beyond blackened beams and charred stone. Yet amid the ruin, one strange image endured in the minds of Salem residents. A pale girl standing in the snow, her hair singed, her eyes vacant, her arms wrapped around a porcelain doll untouched by the inferno dot at first. Townsfolk pitied Amelia Blackwood. She was just 7 years old, suddenly an orphan, her home destroyed. Local churches gathered funds. Neighbors offered food and clothing. And when her mother's sister, Eleanor Simmons, traveled from Boston to take custody of the girl, most agreed it was a blessing. But sympathy soon gave way to unease. In the weeks that followed, Amelia refused to speak to anyone except Isabel. Nurses who tended to her after the fire said she whispered to the doll constantly, pausing as if listening for replies. One recalled in her notes, "Child refuses to eat unless doll is seated beside her." She claims Isabel insists on tasting first. When the doll is removed, child screams and thrashes until returned. The doll itself disturbed many who saw it. Servants muttered that its eyes glinted like living pupils. Some claimed its porcelain hands left faint impressions in Amelia's dresses, as though exerting pressure. Eleanor Simmons dismissed these fears as hysteria, insisting her niece was simply traumatized. But privately, she wrote to her pastor, "The child grows stranger by the day. At night, I hear 2 voices from her room. She says one belongs to Isabel. I fear the doll holds her more tightly than I do." By January of 1912, Amelia's condition worsened. Neighbors reported strange occurrences in Eleanor's Boston home furniture moved in the night, doors opening without cause, shadows lingering where no person stood. Eleanor herself confessed to friends that she sometimes woke to find Amelia standing silently at her bedside, the doll clutched to her chest, her lips moving as though reciting some prayer in the dark. Medical consultation brought little relief. Doctors of the era often explained such behavior as melancholia, with delusional features, a diagnosis that today might be understood as post-traumatic stress. Yet even the physicians found Amelia unsettling. One noted after an examination, patient directs no speech to staff, communication exclusively with doll. When pressed, she warned that Isabel would grow angry if further questions asked. I cannot account for the conviction in her tone. On January 5, 1912, the Boston Herald ran a short but chilling piece. Blackwood heiress sent to sanitarium. Child reportedly disturbed. The article described Amelia's transfer to Lakeside Sanitarium, a private institution for women and children suffering nervous ailments. Her aunt had reluctantly consented after medical advice. The paper's tone was sensational, but its details were grim. Servants fleeing, the girl's refusal to part with the doll, her violent resistance when attempts were made to remove it. What struck later historians most was the sanitarium's own intake record. Child arrived clutching porcelain doll. Doll appears unusually well crafted. Condition of child suggests both grief and delusion. Child insists doll speaks to her. Recommends constant supervision. The records show Amelia was housed in a small private room. Nurses logged nightly disturbances, scratching sounds, objects displaced, reports of a second voice in the dark. More than one nurse requested transfer from her ward. Dr. Harold Bennett, the attending physician, remained skeptical at first. But his notes reveal a gradual shift. At first I dismissed the staff's reports as hysteria. Yet today, during my rounds, I could have sworn the doll's head turned slightly when the child was not touching it. I attribute this to fatigue, but the unease lingers. Amelia herself grew thinner, paler. Yet her bond with Isabel only deepened. She protects me, she told one nurse who dared to ask. She kept me safe in the fire. She'll keep me safe forever. The doll became an extension of Amelia's being. When separated, she screamed with such force that staff feared she would harm herself. When reunited, she grew calm, almost serene, as though soothed by something only she could hear. The tragedy of the Blackwood fire might have ended as another sad story in the long annals of Salem's history. But Amelia's fate at Lakeside ensured the tale would not be forgotten. Within 3 months of her arrival, the child would be dead. And though the sanitarium recorded her passing as heart failure from fever, the details of her final weeks and the mystery of the missing doll would haunt investigators for decades too. For on the night Amelia died, Isabel vanished. The archives of Lakeside Sanitarium dusty, half-forgotten folders tucked into state records tell a story more chilling than any ghost tale. Buried among routine case notes and patient charts are fragments that reveal Amelia Blackwood's final weeks. Together, they sketch the picture of a child bound not only by grief, but by something far stranger. At first, the reports read clinically. January 6, 1912. Patient exhibits mutism, engages in frequent whispering directed toward porcelain doll. Doll will not be relinquished under any circumstances. Such entries could apply to any traumatized child. But within days, the tone shifts. January 9th. Night nurse reports hearing 2 distinct voices from room. Child's bed visible through door. Patient unmoving. Doll positioned in chair across room. No one else present. Nurse requests transfer. January 14th. During examination, patient became agitated when doll removed. Screamed, "Isabel will hurt you like she hurt them." Returned doll immediately. Staff unsettled by conviction and statement. The doll itself became an unspoken presence in the sanitarium. Nurses avoided looking into its glassy eyes. Orderlies refused to clean Amelia's room unless accompanied. Even Dr. Harold Bennett, a man of science, began to betray unease in his handwritten notes. While I have treated many cases of delusional projection, the intensity of this child's fixation is extraordinary. Her identity and sense of safety appear fully merged with the doll. Yet there are occurrences I cannot easily explain: objects moved, unexplained noises, reports from otherwise reliable staff. On January 28th, an incident was logged that shook the ward. A nurse entered Amelia's locked room at dawn to find furniture overturned. Amelia sat calmly on the bed, Isabel in her lap. Asked what had happened, she replied. She was angry. When pressed, she added, "She doesn't like being locked away." No further explanation was given. By February, the entries reveal escalating disturbances. February 3rd. Night nurse reports doll discovered in rocking chair across room, though child claimed she never moved it. Room was locked. No evidence of intrusion. February 10th. Patient refuses meals unless doll positioned at table. Claims Isabel tastes food through her. February 15th. Orderly reports scratching sounds behind walls of patient's room. Walls inspected. No rodents or structural issues found. The most alarming account came on February 18th. Nurse Collins reports severe lacerations on arms after entering room alone. Patient seated on bed throughout. Nurse claims sensation of being grabbed from behind. Doll observed in lap at time of incident. Nurse reliable, not prone to hysteria. Requests reassignment. By now, Dr. Bennett's tone had shifted from detached analysis to something bordering fear. His notes confess moments of doubt, even dread. Tonight, I distinctly heard two voices as I passed the patient's door. Entered immediately, found only child and doll. Doll's head seemed turned toward me upon entry. Mason, orderly, did not observe this, but I cannot dismiss the image. Am I succumbing to the same hysteria I once dismissed? Despite mounting evidence or superstition, Amelia herself remained curiously unchanged. Thin, pale, silent to all but Isabel, she seemed content so long as the doll never left her grasp. She protects me, she repeated when questioned. She promised forever. The staff grew restless. Several resigned. Others demanded the doll be removed, citing its disruptive influence. But every attempt ended in hysteria. On one occasion, Amelia fought with such ferocity that staff feared she would injure herself. Dr. Bennett reluctantly allowed the doll to remain. Better to indulge the delusion, he wrote, than risk harm to the patient. Then, without warning, the case file ends abruptly. The final entry in Bennett's hand is dated March 15, 1912. I can no longer deny that something beyond the scope of medical science is at work here. Tonight, I heard the voices again clearer than ever. One childlike, one raspier, distinctly not Amelia's. Upon entering her room, I observed movement of the doll's head, unmistakable and fluid. I stepped back in alarm. Mason claims not to have seen this. I am requesting consultation with Dr. Frederick of Boston University, though I fear ridicule. Until then, I have ordered staff never to be alone with the patient, or more precisely, with the doll. 8 days later, Amelia was dead. The official cause, heart failure due to sudden fever. Yet the notes surrounding her death raise more questions than answers. Amelia had gone to bed apparently stable. By dawn, she was gone. More disturbing still, when staff inventoried her belongings for transfer to her aunt, one item was missing. Personal effects, one nightgown, one hairbrush, one family photograph, one journal, damaged. Note, porcelain doll unaccounted for. Staff questioned, but deny knowledge. The doll had vanished. Some believed a nurse or orderly took it, either out of fear or greed. Others suggested it was destroyed quietly, the sanitarium unwilling to admit superstition into its records. But rumors spread quickly through Salem that the doll had simply walked away, leaving no trace. Dr. Bennett himself carried the weight of the case for the rest of his life. In later writings, unearthed decades afterward, he confessed that the Blackwood child haunted his dreams. I hear her voice at night, he wrote in 1936. But it is not hers. It is the doll's. She says her sister is waiting. That cryptic phrase, her sister is waiting, would prove crucial years later, when a forgotten trunk, an old diary, and a second doll began to resurface in archives. But in 1912, all anyone knew was this: the Blackwood child was dead, the doll was gone, and the tragedy that began with fire had left behind only silence and fear. For decades after Amelia's death, the story of the Blackwood fire and the haunted doll became little more than a whisper in Salem's folklore. Parents used it to frighten children into obedience. Behave or Isabel will come for you. The sanitarium eventually closed, its files boxed and forgotten in state storage. The Blackwood name faded from memory, their mansion reduced to a patch of grass in a quiet neighborhood park. It might have ended there, another half-forgotten ghost story, if not for the meticulous work of archivists a century later got in the early 2000s. A wave of digitization projects swept through American universities. Among the institutions leading the charge was Cambridge University's Digital Preservation Department. Professors and graduate researchers began scanning old letters, photographs, and case notes, determined to make them accessible to historians worldwide. That was when the Blackwood case surfaced again. One of the first discoveries was a box from the Massachusetts Historical Society labeled simply, Blackwood Family Collection, 1910-1912. Inside were sepia-toned photographs, yellowed newspapers, and charred diary fragments. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary relics of a wealthy New England family. But one image, in particular, drew immediate attention. It showed a little girl, Amelia, standing stiffly on the porch of a Victorian home, clutching a large porcelain doll in her arms. Unlike most children's photographs of the era, where the long exposure required a frozen, joyless pose, Amelia's lips curved in the faintest smile. Yet her eyes told a different story. They weren't looking at the camera. They were focused just beyond it, as if following something invisible to everyone else. Archivists scanning the image noticed another detail when zoomed in. The doll's painted eyes appeared unusually lifelike, reflecting light in a way uncommon for early 20th century porcelain. And its small hand, resting on Amelia's arm, seemed to press into the fabric, leaving faint wrinkles. Impossible, one researcher muttered. It looks as though it's gripping her. The photograph was eerie enough on its own. But then came the family portrait. In that formal image, Amelia stood between her parents, her face pale, her doll absent. Her mother, Catherine, wore a tight-lipped expression, her hand clenched on her husband's arm. Henry stared at the camera, but his posture was tense, as if caught mid-speech. Scholars noted these subtleties, but what truly chilled them was the background. Reflected faintly in the glass cabinet behind the family was a shape another doll, nearly identical to Isabel, placed just out of focus. Two dolls. The revelation reignited interest in the Blackwood case. Researchers began piecing together the fragments. Catherine's diaries, which spoke of a second doll hidden in a trunk. The sanitarium notes where Amelia whispered, "She's angry when locked away." The story was no longer mere folklore. There was evidence, tangible and unnerving, preserved in ink and photographs. By 2015, the collection became the subject of a symposium on American folklore and material culture. Scholars debated whether the dolls were simply unusual European craftsmanship or part of a larger tradition of Romanian superstition. One paper traced the family's European travels, citing Catherine's diary entry about meeting an elderly doll maker in a remote Romanian village. The woman, Catherine wrote, insisted the dolls were sisters and should never be separated. The archivists also uncovered the medical notes of Dr. Harold Bennett, the physician who oversaw Amelia at Lakeside. Long believed lost, his journals surfaced among his estate papers donated to the university. They contained chilling confessions. I hear two voices at night when I pass her door. One is Amelia's, the other I cannot explain. Last evening I saw the doll's head turn, unassisted. I stepped back in alarm. Mason orderly did not see, though I am certain. Most disturbing was his final note. They are sisters. The old woman's words returned to me in dreams. One cannot exist without the other. God forgive me. I have failed this child. Suddenly, the Blackwood tragedy was no longer a half-forgotten ghost tale, but a case study straddling the line between folklore and documented history. Newspapers from 1911 and 1912 were re-examined. Obituaries were cross-referenced. Even property records of the sanitarium were scrutinized, confirming that Amelia had indeed been buried without mention of the doll. But the rediscovery brought more than academic curiosity. It raised uncomfortable questions. If two dolls existed, what became of them? Isabel, Amelia's constant companion, had vanished from the sanitarium without explanation. And the second doll, hidden away in a trunk, had it survived the fire? The photographs suggested both were real. Catherine's diary insisted they should never be separated, and Dr. Bennett's confession hinted he may have kept one. In fact, an item listed among Bennett's donations to Cambridge's historical collection matched the description. Porcelain doll, European, circa 1900, exceptional craftsmanship. For decades, it had sat quietly in a university display case, viewed by thousands of students who passed by without realizing its history. Some assistants claimed it shifted positions between nights. Others swore its head tilted differently by morning. Most dismissed these as campus ghost stories. But once the photographs and Bennett's notes resurfaced, those whispers no longer seemed so harmless. Was no longer a question of whether the Blackwood dolls had existed. They had. The evidence was in ink, glass, porcelain. The only mystery was whether both survived, and if so, where Isabel, Amelia's doll, might be now. For over a century, the Blackwood tragedy existed as a puzzle with missing pieces. A burned mansion. A child who survived. Two dolls whispered about, but never fully accounted for. Yet in the 21st century, digitization projects, estate donations, and one archivist's persistence brought the pieces together. What those researchers found, however, left them not with answers, but with shivers that no science could easily dismiss. It began with a late-night email. Professor Eleanor Wright, head of Cambridge's Digital Preservation Department, had spent weeks combing through the Blackwood materials, photographs, diaries, sanitarium notes. She was convinced that Dr. Harold Bennett, the physician who documented Amelia's final months, had quietly taken one of the dolls after her death. And she had evidence. In the 1950s, Bennett donated a porcelain doll to the university's historical collection, described as European craftsmanship, circa 1900. For decades, it had sat in a glass display case, labeled as nothing more than a fine antique. When compared to the photographs of the Blackwood doll, its features matched perfectly, even down to the faint discoloration on one porcelain hand. But which doll was it? Isabel, Amelia's constant companion, or the sister hidden in the trunk? One evening, Wright received an email from the Massachusetts Historical Society with the subject line, "Found her." Attached was a modern photograph, digital, crisp, unmistakable. The doll in the display case. Same gown, same delicate face, same lifelike eyes. But in the image, its head appeared tilted, gazing directly at the camera. Disturbed, Wright rushed to the library's display room. And there it was, just as pictured, motionless, pristine, watching. The identification card confirmed it. Donated by the estate of Dr. Harold Bennett, 1953. He had indeed kept it for decades, haunted by dreams, before passing it into the care of the university. But the real shock came weeks later, when campus police investigated a break-in. Security cameras, oddly, had gone dark for 17 minutes in the early hours of the morning. When they flickered back online, the case was open. The doll was gone. In its place sat a handwritten note, "Sisters reunited." The circle complete, it was signed only with an elegant scrawl, "Eleanor. To many." It appeared a hoax, a theft staged with flair. But then the Massachusetts Historical Society reported something stranger. Among its archives, which should have held only scanned fragments, the original burned diary of Amelia Blackwood had vanished, and in its place appeared a second porcelain doll, identical to the one stolen from Cambridge, only dressed in lighter fabric with a tiny brooch at its collar. Historians could scarcely believe it. Two dolls, both real, both resurfaced within days of each other after more than a century of speculation. Photographs taken by police confirmed the objects were not forgeries. Their craftsmanship matched the Romanian origins described in Catherine Blackwood's diary. Their features mirrored those in the century-old photographs. And though their porcelain and gowns bore the faint wear of age, neither showed cracks or scorching. Despite the fire and the passage of time, the two dolls were brought together under controlled conditions at the State Museum, placed side by side for the first time since 1911. Archivists reported nothing unusual, no movement, no voices, no disturbances. But what unsettled them was subtler. The dolls' positions in photographs seemed to shift ever so slightly. In the morning, their hands rested near each other. By evening, fingers brushed. A week later, one image showed them with clasped porcelain hands, though no staff admitted arranging them. It was like they wanted to be together. One curator whispered Dot when the rediscovery was presented at a 2019 historical symposium. The room fell silent. Scholars were speechless, not because the dolls proved the supernatural, but because the weight of evidence left no easy explanation. Diaries described them. Photographs showed them. Sanitarium records detailed their presence. Dr. Bennett's confessions admitted his fear. And now, both dolls stood in glass cases, lifelike as the day Amelia clutched Isabel in the snow. Experts debated endlessly. Were the dolls merely exquisite examples of European craftsmanship, their uncanny realism stirring hysteria among superstitious servants? Was Amelia's behavior nothing more than trauma, her fixation magnified into legend? Was the fire a tragic accident, rewritten by gossip into a tale of curses? Or was there something more? Catherine Blackwood's diary had warned, "They are sisters. They must never be separated." And separated they had been until death, fire, and madness followed. Only when reunited did the whispers stop. Even more unsettling was the diary fragment discovered alongside. Isabel in the archives, dated the day before the fire. In Amelia's childish hand, the words stood clear. "Isabel says someone named Eleanor will help us. She says it will be more than 100 years, but she knows. She always knows." The handwriting was tested. It was authentic. And though many dismissed it as eerie coincidence, but the modern professor who rediscovered the dolls was also named Eleanor, the connection gnawed at others. Could Amelia or Isabel have known? Today, the two dolls remain locked in a climate-controlled vault, brought out only under supervision. Researchers continue to study them, scanning every seam, testing every thread. Nothing has revealed trickery. No hidden mechanisms. No rational explanation for the stories that shadow them. And so the Blackwood mystery endures. A fire that spared only a child and her doll. A sanitarium where nurses swore porcelain moved on its own. A physician haunted to his death. And finally, two dolls reunited after more than a century silent, motionless, yet always seeming to watch Dot, as one historian put it after viewing them in person. Whether you believe in curses or not, the fact remains. These dolls were present at tragedy after tragedy. And when they were separated, death followed. Now that they are together again, perhaps we should pray they remain that way. For in the end, what historians found 112 years later left them speechless, not because it answered the mystery, but because it didn't. The dolls remain, side by side, their porcelain hands forever clasped, their painted eyes fixed on whoever dares to look too long. And some stories, especially those carried in porcelain, smiles were never meant to end.